What's up, everyone? My name is Dominic Andre, and today I'm going to be reacting to the newest Jubilee video, Rich vs. Poor, Is the Economy Rigged? This is a super interesting topic, and I can't wait to break it down, so let's get right into it.
Being poor is a choice.
I'm surprised. I thought a lot more people would walk up on the rich side. That's good.
I do not want to be disingenuous to ignore systemic issues that we all experience, but I feel like it's 2021 and there's a lot of free resources. I mean, Facebook has a lot of free courses. I think that poor is also a mindset.
By Facebook, I don't know what you mean. Are you saying Facebook offers courses on how to make money? Like they teach you how to get a job? Are you saying that Facebook, like people on Facebook post courses and they're free, and how do I know which one's the right one and which ones am I going to be good at, which ones are scams, which ones are not? I think it's a little bit disingenuous to just randomly say there's just a lot of free resources, so like there's no reason to complain, or so.
I agree. Originally, when I came out here, I started straight at the homeless shelter. I had to flee from domestic.
So this is important. Listen to what she's saying. She said when she first came out here, she was at the homeless shelter. So let's listen in later on, because she's saying being poor is a choice, so she probably isn't poor anymore. But wait till you see what she says later on.
Violence from my family. Most people in general don't choose to be poor, but since I've been here, specifically in LA, a lot of people outside, they don't want to come into the shelter because they'd rather be in the tents.
That's somewhat true. I've actually interviewed homeless people, and there are some of them that wanted to stay outside. One of them I actually interviewed, I think his name was William Wells, I think at the time. And I asked him, and I said, well, he's like, I have a granddaughter who has a home and I can go live with her. Well, why don't you? And he struggles with addiction, mental illness, doesn't want to put her at risk, but his wife died when he went to jail. And when he came out of jail, he basically had probably a mental breakdown from what he described and just didn't want to participate in society anymore as it stands. And so people need to understand that they don't, again, choose to just want to stay outside. There's a reason for that, and that reason is usually out of their control. They were not just like, you know what, it's just like nice and sunny out here, and I love that it rains and it gets snowy or cold, and I'm just going to stay out here. It's great. There's a lot of reasons that go into it, so we need to take that into account.
I mean, I grew up poor, so I have been on both sides of the coin, and I can reflect and look back on some of the lifestyle choices that I was making, some of the people that I was hanging around. So I don't think that people can initially control if they're born into poverty, but I think that there is a certain level of control that comes along with being able to have that determination and that resilience.
I think, how would they get that determination and resilience? I think that's also disingenuous to just assume that, like, look, you've got that determination. If you have that determination, okay, if is a really important word there. How do I get it? We know that when it comes to psychology, a lot of this stuff is how you were raised and how your genetics are. And neither of those are in your control. So for those people who were taught how to be courageous or adventurous or risky financially, they were taught that since they were kids. And so I can't just erase my childhood and have my parents teach me a completely different thing. I was taught a certain thing, and it's very hard to break that mold. And so I'm being put in a hole that other people may not be, and that's a very hard barrier for me to break through. So being poor wasn't my choice because I'm stuck behind a barrier that you don't have to deal with.
Can I have the disagreeer step forward?
We need to realize that these people are on the street not because of their own choosing, but because of the system that we live in perpetuates these things.
If I could speak to that, I come from a family that once relied on welfare and food stamps, and I have been blessed enough to make millions of dollars in real estate. But had I bought real estate from 2005 to 2008, I'd probably be bankrupt today. I just bought it at the right time.
People wish to be rich, they don't want to be rich. The difference is, do you take action? That being said, I agree with a lot of your points you're making about people not really having the resources or the opportunity to have any kind of action plan.
Some people don't even want to be rich. Like, I don't want to be rich. But I also don't want to be poor.
So why is she giving a face right there? Like, this is the problem with our society, is like it's made humans so focused on money as the core of our personality that she's making a face like, you don't want to be rich? What's wrong with you? I think there's something wrong with you, and you've forgotten how to be a regular human, that you're so caught up in money that you don't understand that some people just want to enjoy their life, be with their family, and they don't care about having a gold necklace or gold earrings, right? Like, I think this is ridiculous to make a face like that. It is ridiculous.
Or I'm happy in the middle. And I would want to live in society where they could perpetuate people to lift themselves out of poverty through programs and just be in the middle.
Exactly.
Billionaires should not exist.
I don't see how anyone could ever spend $1 billion. It's not a necessity to have that much money, and I feel like there is a certain cap in which, like, you can completely survive and thrive with this amount of money, and then if you surpass that, you're just hoarding.
And then we've seen what people with billions of dollars are doing with their money. They're going to space for fun. Like,
Right.
Clearly, if we tax those people properly, get their wealth and distribute it to people who need it, that'd be a much better use than going to space for fun.
Personally,
I don't know. Before I get started, I mean, what's your take? Do you think that we should take, let's say, the hundreds of millions of dollars that Jeff Bezos used to go to space and help the tens of thousands of children that may be, underserved, that may be starving, that may be malnourished, obviously, or having undereducated systems in place? Do you think that it would be beneficial to say, hey, Jeff Bezos, you don't get to go to space, but all these kids are going to live a little bit better of a life, if not a lot better of a life? Or do you think that it doesn't matter if those kids chose to be poor or chose to starve, and Jeff Bezos should have the ability to go to space and be uninterrupted financially by that? I think it definitely is up to you. I mean, some people might think, like, I don't care. It's not my job to care for these kids. If they die, they die. I don't care. And some people might look at it like, you know what? Yeah, maybe it isn't fair that we take away Jeff Bezos' money. And maybe he did work really hard for it. But at the same time, if it means that he doesn't get to go to space, which basically changes nothing in his life, but we can change tens of thousands of lives of individuals who can live longer now, maybe not die of basic things like the flu or diarrhea, and can live better lives. It's something that you have to kind of answer yourself. What do you want out of society? Did we build a society to just say every man for himself, every person for themselves? Or is it built so that we can basically pull the bottom half out by using the resources, the brains, and the power of the top half?
I don't think there's an issue with billionaires existing. The issue for me is that they need to be held accountable the same way poor people do. And I'm talking about the justice system.
When you look at a lot of billionaires who have gotten that way because of the just incredible amount of value they've given to society, I won't even talk about a huge, crazy billionaire. I'll talk about Jay-Z, who is a billionaire. He made amazing music. That's how he became a billionaire. And so I don't think it's the government's job to interject and say, okay, you have too much, we need to give it away. I mean, it would also never happen in any other arena. No one's gonna go, hey, Simone Biles, you have too many gold medals. We're gonna take them from you and we're gonna give them to the other people who weren't as talented as you.
I completely agree.
I don't think that makes any sense. I think that the Olympics has literally tons of rules to basically make it fair. I mean, there was even an instant, I think it was in ice skating, where this person did a certain type of flip, and because it's so dangerous and not many people can do it, they literally banned that flip from being in the Olympics because it wasn't fair, because other people would have to risk their life to do that trick to be able to compete. And the goal was, with the Olympics and things like that, is like, it's supposed to be competitive. Not, our goal isn't to make it that one person wins every single time. There's no point to that. The goal is to make it competitive where everyone has a chance. So we have a lot of rules put in place. When it comes to football, everyone wears basically the same type of padding. You're not allowed to put spikes on your equipment and hurt other people. They try and make it even for everyone. The whole idea of sports is that there are literally tons of rules to make sure that it's as even as possible. So in every other arena, it does happen. I'm pretty sure there are even financial caps to how much you can spend when it comes to certain types of sports, maybe like NASCAR or maybe like football or the NBA, when it comes to how much you can spend on your roster, things like that. There are limits. Like, there would be a complete destruction of the system, or let's just say sports, if one company, one person was able to basically say, I'm going to pay every top player and I just get to have them on my team and no one else has a choice unless you have more money than me, and I'm just going to keep dominating year after year. There's a reason why we put in laws and rules into these systems to be like, well, this isn't fun. No one wants to watch it. This ruins the whole thing. And just like society, we want to put in rules to make it as even as possible.
Agree.
I completely disagree. I feel like that is the government's job.
Exactly.
Jay-Z, like you said, Jay-Z made his money from music. That's his labor.
And he also says that he's basically saying that Jay-Z created all this amazing value. Okay, we can get it. His music's good. But without his music, would we have survived? Are people going to die without his music? When we talk about value, that's really weird to say. For example, if I create a toy for children, that does nothing, right? Just a toy for children. There are tons of them. You're not going to look at me like, this guy created so much value for our society. Not really at all. So we can look at certain people and say, are they creating that much value? There are industries out there that aren't beneficial. Is he going to say that the billionaires on the Purdue company that basically started the opioid crisis that we have today, that they created so much value? There are a lot of billionaires and millionaires that started companies that negatively impacted. So by saying that they created a lot of money or jobs, that just assumes there's a positive value attributed to what they did in society. Not true. Not always the case.
He's a musician. He's selling his talent. But then when he invested in the alcohol, then he's using other people who are harvesting the wheat, the agave. They're breaking their back. They're using their labor.
So do you think that he shouldn't invest in those people? Should they just like say, the hell with your dreams, I'm not going to invest in you?
Bill, my guy, take it back for a second. You just said that it's the dream of those laborers to pick the agave, harvest the agave, and be out in the fields, right? That's their dream. And by not starting the alcohol company, Jay-Z is depriving them of that dream to do that, to get paid pennies on the dollar, to do what they love. First off, I can guarantee that if I picked up any of them and said, hey, here's a better job that pays you more, they're going to take it in a heartbeat. They're not going to say, my dream is to be here. It's what they know best. They're probably a lot less likely to want to change jobs. They weren't raised with a certain type of tools or mindset, or didn't get a college education based on the environment that they lived in. And so by saying that we're depriving them of their dreams of harvesting agave, so we should pay them pennies on the dollar and make their dreams come true, that what, we should praise Jay-Z for doing that? I think this is absolutely ridiculous mindset. You really need to rethink what you just said.
What about the job?
What do you mean?
They're having jobs.
Yeah, but
What does that mean, Jenny? You can't just say they're having jobs. Like, hey, if I have you go murder someone and I pay you, it's a job. Like, there are certain jobs that people don't want to do. They just have to do. They're in a position that they're basically forced like slaves to do because they have no other choice. In fact, there are actually places in America today that they ended up finding people who are basically indentured servants or slaves, right? This happens a lot where people are basically forced into working a certain job because they don't have any other choice. Trust me, if you went around to 90% of people today working bad jobs or low-paying jobs and gave them an opportunity to move, they would in an instant. But there are a lot of barriers in place. There's reasons why they don't.
But how much are they getting paid for the jobs? Or those jobs in the third world where they're getting paid pennies,
Yeah,
and then Jay-Z makes
job.
Not an argument either. You cannot say that, look, I know that we're hitting them, or I know that we're paying them so little that their kids are starving to death, but it's better than no job. That's the equivalent of saying, look, I know that your husband or wife is abusing you, but it's better than not having one at all. Am I right? Not an argument. Does not work. You cannot build yourself up by saying, but I'm offering you a job, even if you're starving to death and you're working and you have no other choice. At least you have a job, my guy.
millions off their labor.
How much do you pay your employees?
You think harvesting isn't going to exist?
More than enough. I would love to speak to her employees and say, I'm assuming you don't want to raise because you're being paid more than enough. So one, there are two choices here. One, that she does pay them enough and they're happy, and that's great. And she is misunderstanding that a lot of CEOs and business owners are not paying their employees the way she might be paying their employees. Or she's not paying them enough. She perceives that she is, and she just assumes that even though she's bringing $400,000 of profit to herself this year, that she's paying them enough. it's really interesting. She might be completely disconnected from her employees, or she might be a really good CEO or founder and just assume that everyone must be like her, which is disingenuous as well.
Jay-Z doesn't invest?
If I may interject, I pay my employees like incredibly well, and I let them choose their own hours. Someone who works for me is a single mother. I pay her $50 an hour. And I think that people that are providing jobs and opportunities, you can hate on them all you want, but at the end of the day, like, nobody would work that job if it wasn't in some way, shape, or form worth it.
I think that's another misconception. There are a lot of people who work jobs that are not worth it. I know several people very close to me that I'm not going to mention that are working jobs where they're having to drive hours because it's the only job that they qualify for a number of reasons that were not in their control. They're almost losing money because of the gas that they're paying, the time that it's taking to drive out there, and the little of hours that they're doing, but it's literally the only job that they can get. And trust me, I've helped so many people in vocational training. I've helped so many people get better jobs, and there are many people that I know that cannot qualify for better jobs, do not have the opportunity to get better jobs, struggling with health issues, mental issues, a number of other things. So we cannot say that, if it wasn't worth it, people would just get better jobs. This is just completely discounting the number of issues that other people face. And it's just basically living in privilege and just assuming that everyone must have the same opportunities and issues that I do.
People who make $1 billion get a fraction of the value they create. Everybody here who has a business understands that.
They do not get a fraction of the value that they create. What he's saying is if a company makes $1 billion and I'm the CEO and I founded it, that I'm basically creating $1 billion worth of value. No, I am not. I may have started the company, and that is I can argue and say, well, I created the initial value. Great. But as time goes on, I'm doing less and less work as those people are doing all the work. For example, if you look at Steve Jobs when it comes to Apple, I guarantee you during the last 10 years of his business, 15 years of his business, if you put him in the engineer spot and said, hey, you created all this value, so you could probably create this next iPhone, you could probably build it. He couldn't. He couldn't. He did not have the mindset. He did not have the skill set to build it. He did not know what he was doing when it comes to so many other of those positions. And so by saying they create value is basically saying everyone else in the company is not creating value. They're creating all of the value because without them, it would not exist. And they could say the same for the CEO, but great. But without employees, your company couldn't exist. So you're equally as valuable. The only difference is you took the initial risk to start the business. But other than that, after the business is running itself, it's getting its own investments from outside investors. They're basically having investors come in, or if it's publicly traded, that is not related to you at all, right? You have added so little value at this point because so many other people, there are tens of thousands of employees creating value. So you need to stop looking at CEOs like without them, there would be nothing. I get it. We can even say when it comes to Apple, like the company started failing without him. But there are a number of people that could have taken that job, that could have taken it back up. But Steve Jobs just happened to be one of the people that brought it back up and brought the company into a success story.
Even Jay-Z only gets 15 cents a record he sells. Okay?
Yes, that's because he got exploited by the record label who's using his label to make money. It's the same
you
thing
keep using this word exploiting like you understand the record business, of which I am in. Okay? Record labels back hundreds of artists. Do you know how many go busto? Yeah. Okay? They're taking risk in an artist by the tapes, paying the engineers, marketing, etc. They're exploiting them. They're taking on a bet. And they can't just give everybody 50-50. They'll go bankrupt.
So he's right and he's wrong. They are taking on a bet, but I can't just say because I'm taking on a bet, I can exploit you, right? For example, if I say, hey, I'm starting a screen printing business, I'm going to pay you 50 cents an hour. And you're like, what do you mean 50? I'm like, look, I'm taking on the risk, my guy. Take it easy. You're going to work for 50 cents an hour because I'm taking all the risk. And I could go busto or I can go bankrupt. So you need to just take the 50 cents an hour and deal with it because I'm taking a lot of the risk. I think that's a bad mindset, but at the same time, we do need to understand that a lot of businesses do fail and a lot of people put their own financial reputation on the line and their own money on the line. So it is a little bit of a mixed bag.
Well, you don't understand the record business and you're just yelling out these words exploiting like you know what you're talking about.
Almost every single artist out there will agree with him that they are being exploited. So this mindset of like, oh, we're not being exploited is completely wrong.
But you don't.
That's why
they're not exploiting.
That's why there's one Jay-Z and not millions
exactly.
of them.
My name is Ginny, and I run a software design agency. And this year I'm going to be taking home about $400,000. When I started my business, that was like all consuming for me. Everything I did in my life was for business. And so I think my partner felt a lot of neglect And so a lot of our arguments, a lot of the times that we had issues were because of my absence.
So I think what Jenny is trying to say, and maybe I'm speaking for her, maybe I shouldn't hear, is that I think she's trying to portray that, she put in all this time into her business and thus she should reap a majority of the rewards or a large portion of the rewards. And to some degree, it's understandable to say, like, look, I worked all of these hours night and day. But it's also disingenuous, again, to basically say that your employees aren't working hard or that they're not working and it's not interrupting their life. For example, I know many laborers that are working 12 hours. I know many EMTs that are getting paid roughly minimum wage, working 18 to 24 hours, if 12-hour shifts at the lowest. And they're also having problems with their partner because they're not being able to be there because they're trying to work to basically barely survive. And so while you're struggling, putting in all this time at your job, so are the employees. And they have no control over how much they're getting paid. They have no control over what you do with the business. So if you make a mistake, they're getting screwed over for something you did and they had no control over. And they're working 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours, some of these employees shifts. And they're struggling and missing their partners and fighting with their partners over the lack of money that you're providing them. And so the mindset of like, these many CEOs, not just Jenny or anyone, but like just a lot of founders and CEOs who basically say, well, I took all the effort and I took all the risk and I put all the time in, and so thus I should be getting paid millions and millions of dollars, is basically saying that their employees aren't putting in a lot of work, that they're not basically sleeping and thinking about their job. A lot of people are. It's very common for people to be stressed about their job at work or at home and have them affect their life. And so at the end of the day, after your small struggle of, maybe 6 months, a year, your employees may be struggling for years because you're not paying them enough for years and they're struggling financially. They're working over, they're overworking their hours. I mean, we see this in tons of industries like the movie industry, the labor business, the manufacturing industries, so many other industries that have these issues where they're being overworked and underpaid. And so just because you're overworking and getting underpaid for a short amount of time and because you're taking the risk doesn't mean that other people aren't struggling. So not to discount what you're doing, not just Jenny, but everyone out there, but there are a lot of employees that are putting in just as much work as their CEOs and struggling financially on top of it. So we have to take that into account.
Economy is rigged.
Of course the economy is rigged. There's no argument. I don't even know why. I'm really curious to see what they say here.
If you're born in a rich family, you have more opportunities. And as someone who is poor, living paycheck to paycheck, you're stuck having to apply to jobs and settle for things that you don't like instead of being able to follow your passions.
I agree and disagree. I agree that it's rigged to incentivize certain areas and behaviors, like we have millions and millions of farm subsidies, so it supports agribusiness. It may support one area like real estate or capital investment over labor, but I don't think it's generally rigged to basically keep the rich guy rich and the poor guy poor. That part I'll disagree.
Almost every single rich person would agree that the system is the way that it is today. Almost everyone would agree that if you're rich, it's easier to be rich, and if you're poor, it's harder to be rich, and that people who are rich have more control over the government, more control over the bills that are passed. For example, if we look at something, let's just say there's a tax cut that, let's just say, the American people get to vote on. Well, the billionaires have billions of dollars to spend into marketing, convincing everyone else that it may be a good idea. And everyone else doesn't have that capacity because they may not have as much money to combat that ideology or that vote that they want to pass. And so we cannot say that, like, oh, the economy isn't rigged and that everyone has an equal chance. They do not have an equal chance. Whether it was on purpose or not, it is built so that people who have a lot of money can pay for CPAs who can learn all those loopholes. For example, a cheap lawyer is not going to be as good as an expensive lawyer. They're not going to spend as much time. They're maybe not as well educated on the specific topic. For example, you're getting a divorce and I'm spending $10,000 an hour, let's just say, ridiculous price, but $10,000 an hour on my attorney. Well, they're probably going to be putting in so much more work. They're probably going to be a much better expert on the topic and be able to argue my case better than, let's just say, my spouses who can't afford an attorney that's basically charging $50 an hour, $100 an hour. And so my attorney is going to have a lot more resources and I'm going to be able to win that battle, win that court case over my spouse. And that's going to happen in every part of the industry. When it comes to the tax code, I'm going to be able to hire professionals that have a lot more time and expertise to be able to make sure that I'm not paying as much percentage-wise than someone who's poor, who is affording the TurboTax that is $50 for the fee, right? And so we know from tons and tons of data that the tax system is on purpose very complicated to make it very easy for rich people to get by and continually not pay as much taxes as poor people, while basically building this facade that like, oh my God, the taxes are so high when they're never even paying the effective tax or paying the tax rate, and their effective tax rate is much lower. So I don't even know why this is an argument. It's obviously rigged in many different ways.
But there are certain policies like the reinvestment in productive people's hands for building real estate. I would say that's a good thing, right?
When you say
I don't
productive people, like, do you just mean people with money?
No, I mean people that actually take that money, organize people, put it to work, and create value. That's what I mean by productive people.
So I would love to ask him, I assume he probably wouldn't say this, but are people who don't invest their money because they're not being paid enough but work just as hard as someone else, those aren't productive people? So I'm assuming what he's saying is his employees who don't reinvest their money because they may not be being paid a lot, they're not productive, right? So I'm curious to see what he would say about that.
But who creates the value? It's the workers who create the value.
Listen,
It's both. I think that's a little bit wrong to say that the CEOs don't create value. It's true that they take the risk to start the company. They do work many hours. Many of them work more hours than the average employee. But they may have less struggles because financially they're worried about completely different things. But I do understand that, you know, the employees do create a lot of the value.
People who take risk and they risk their money, that's creating value. What you discount is the person willing to risk their savings, okay, and provide capital for that venture and to be paid last. So if it goes busto, the worker still gets paid, the investor doesn't. If it goes well, the worker gets paid and the investor makes money. You discount the role of capital and savings in any type of venture. Like my mom didn't want to be rich. She wanted to be a school teacher and work and do that and live in the middle ground, and that's fine.
So I think it's also really interesting. Let's just take a look at Trump, right? Not to argue politics or anything, but if we look at his investments, anytime he made an investment that didn't work out, he literally claimed bankruptcy, wrote it off on his taxes, was able to extract loans from the business before it went down. And so when I look at that value, he created very little value. He created value for himself while also simultaneously basically pulling money away from people. He often didn't pay people. He often screwed people over. And that's just him. You know, that there's a ton of billionaires and millionaires that do this. So it's not just a Trump thing. And so we can't look at this like, oh my God, the CEOs, they're risking all their money to start this business and we should praise them. In reality, the system, again, is rigged for them to be able to do things like Chapter 11 restructuring, be able to basically get rid of their debt, not owe people, which then goes back on, let's just say, the taxpayers when the economy crashes and they do a bailout. And the CEOs and the billionaires and millionaires continue to make money on the backs of everyone else. So I think, again, that's another way that the economy is rigged, that the billionaires are never really risking their money because they can always just ask the government for more money and the government will hand it to them because that's who's paying them. And when it comes to the American average worker, they're having to pay that money to bail them out. So a little bit of an argument there is to say that it's a lot easier for rich people than it is for poor people.
But there are people like me who want to take a lot of risk and get a lot of reward. And we put that capital to work. And you should respect that.
And I think it's true. I think that someone who is just starting out their business, let's just say they've got $30,000 to their name, I think those people should deserve a large chunk of the money early on in their business. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that just because you're taking a risk, you get to exploit people significantly. I would hope that they wouldn't argue that, hey, since I'm starting my business, I'm going to pay you 50 cents an hour, and I'm let's just say I'm one of the only businesses in town, and you just got to deal with it or move. In reality, we should say, like, no, you shouldn't have a business that pays people 50 cents an hour. There are many jobs that I can convince people to work that would make me a ton of money if I got them to work for 10 cents an hour, but those businesses shouldn't exist, and we should agree on that. So I think that there's this balance of, like, we get it. CEOs do take the risk. They should get some reward, but at the same time, a lot of them take on investments from other people, and those people do get a lot of money back, and at the same time, the workers are still being underpaid. So you can still pay your workers a good amount and also get paid well too. So I think people are getting confused. No one's saying that CEOs are making too much. We're saying they're making too much in comparison to the average worker, because back in the day they were being paid a lot, but they were only being paid like 10 to, whatever. I think it was like 3 to 10 to 15 times more. Now it's like hundreds of times more than their average workers. So the dynamic has drastically changed from years ago.
Hi, my name is Bill Perkins. I run a hedge fund. I do investments and other things. I manage.
Thought he was
my
in the
money. How much I make
music industry.
annually. Sometimes I lose money, but I'd say on average over 10 million a year. I took care of my dad in the last years of his life. He died broke. I did not inherit my money. I made it myself. I really don't care about.
I'd really like to, from a psychological standpoint, talk with Bill and discover what led him to become a millionaire, right? Was it an opportunity, or did he come up with an idea on his own, no support from anyone, no investment from anyone, or whatever it might be, and didn't get connected with anyone and was just able to just start a multi-million-dollar business from the ground up, from his head, without exploiting anyone, without, doing anything? I think realistically, he had an opportunity that other people didn't. He had, a personality that other people don't, and that he was able to basically, let's say, finesse his way or connect his way to something that other people just can't. You can't look at someone, let's just say, with social anxiety and be like, why aren't you networking? Like, what do you mean? I have social anxiety. It's not something I choose to have. And it's a lot harder for me, especially for people who have severe anxiety. They may never be able to act in the way that, let's just say, Bill acts, and maybe he gets connected with businesses. So I think people need to understand that not everyone has the same opportunities, both genetically and environmentally.
The money. Money is a tool for me to have the experiences that I want to have out of life. And there are many experiences that I want to have.
I want to know what those are. You want a mega
have
yacht?
a certain level of awareness and knowledge to know the rules of the game.
Exactly.
And I think that there are barriers put in place to kind of prevent people from knowing the rules, but I think that it's out there and you can have access to it.
But no one's saying that it's impossible. But if there's a barrier, then it's rigged. No one's saying rigged in the sense that, like, no matter what, you will never make it. But if I'm playing a game like Monopoly and you start off with 5,000 Monopoly dollars and I start off with 0, you're going to tell me that the game's not rigged? It doesn't mean I can't win, but you're really going to tell me that the game's not rigged? It doesn't make any sense.
I think that knowing
I
the
agree
rules
with
is
you.
different.
I know the rules, and I think they're disgusting. That's why I want to
Why
change
don't you
them.
play the game then? I mean, you can.
I think they're disgusting. Why would I want to play the game?
I will say one thing that I've learned through working in the mental health field, working in my master's in political science, clinical psychology, bachelor's in philosophy. I really learned a lot of different aspects of life. And one thing I will say that I think could help a lot of people is, although the economy might be rigged and although your community might be oppressed, which makes it harder for you to get out, that's no excuse to just say, well, then I'm just going to give up. I think that mindset's only going to make things worse for you. I'm not saying that if you just have a good mindset, you'll be rich, you'll get out of it. But at the same time, this system takes years and decades and decades and decades to change, and you kind of just sitting there complaining isn't going to help. There are some people who don't have a choice because mentally that's all they can do, but there are a lot of people who do have the ability to get out of where they are with a little bit of help, maybe resources and opportunity. So the other thing is, again, it's not really their fault. It may not be the opportunity. So I think one thing that a lot of people can do, the government can do better, rich people can do better, is reach a hand out and help people in those positions to get access to that information. Because, that person earlier on was saying that there's all this free information on Facebook. I didn't know that, and I make a lot of money. I had no idea that there's some. Where would I even go for that? Am I just going to type how to make a lot of money on Facebook? What if I get a scam? What if I get someone who doesn't know what they're talking about but thinks they do? What if I get someone who's just like mentally ill and they're just posting stuff and I'm just assuming that they're confident and they know what they're doing? It's a little bit, again, disingenuous to just assume that since the information's out there or the possibilities out there, that there's no excuse. But at the same time, everyone should try, because at least it's going to make your life better if you do try, rather than just kind of suffering where you are.
As a real estate guy, I can make millions of dollars and use the exact same tax loopholes that a Donald Trump would use and pay effectively no tax. And does that make me a bad guy, or did I just study the tax code?
It makes you a bad guy, yeah.
You think so?
If you do that, yeah.
I'm following
definitely.
the law to a T.
The law is wrong.
Yeah, I think horrible argument that, but I'm following the law. Again, if someone owns a slave back in the day and then they say, well, I'm following the law to a T. Like, I'm doing everything the law tells me I'm doing it. That's not an argument. So I think they just lost that whole thing, because you can't use that as an argument. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Why is it wrong? It's the
But
law.
I'm not.
You think just because it's law, it's always right?
No, certainly not. Certainly
No,
not.
I'm not
Exactly.
saying
But-
that.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. Yeah.
I'm not
No, the
saying
law is
that,
written
but
to encourage investment is what.
That's relative. Encourage investment for who? Why are companies like Apple hoarding hundreds of billions of dollars? Why are millionaires and billionaires not spending their money? You know, there are a lot of billionaires out there who have billions of dollars who are not reinvesting their money. They're leaving it in the company that they have and they're just calling it a day. So it's not written for people to do that. It's in fact written the opposite way. A lot of people are just hoarding their money and grabbing as much as they can forever. Not because there's no benefit for me to reinvest my money if it's not a guarantee that I'm going to make more. So if I'm Apple, I'm not going to randomly just hire 10,000 new employees just because we have the money. There needs to be a reason for that. And so we're not going to just hire more people for no reason. They have the money to. Even if they hired 5,000 more employees, it would not cause any issue to them. They have so much money, but they don't for a reason, because it's not in their benefit to hire people for no reason. It's only in their benefit to hire the amount of people they need to grow their business at the rate that they're growing it.
Which they want. So he's investing. So like the law is written to encourage certain things. If you disagree with it, you can go lobby and change.
You don't think the law is written for wealthy people to get away with taxes and poor people to not? There's so many examples of this, so it's really weird to say.
But he's not a bad guy.
I know you mentioned that there are barriers.
I wouldn't call him a bad guy, though.
People kind of in impoverished conditions, but I don't think that we all acknowledge like the mental.
Well, that's where I was going. So if I can reflect on myself, I mean, I remember when I was living in poverty, I was just trying to survive. So I didn't even have the brain capacity to try to, or the willpower to kind of even desire to access the rules of the economy. But I mean, I had an epiphany, and I literally woke up one day and I was like, I cannot live the rest of my life like this.
I want to ask her what that epiphany was. What was it that caused that, right? She's making it kind of seem like she just woke up and decided one day. Epiphanies happen for a reason, whether it's an event in your life or something's going on in your brain that you're not really controlling, right? There's something going on that is processing information that happened that's causing you to do that. You know, there are certain people, let's just say, that go through the military and get PTSD, and there are certain people who go through the exact same thing in the military and don't get PTSD. We're not going to say, well, they just chose to get PTSD. There are certain people's brains that are wired differently and they react to information differently. So let's just say she might have been abused and she took that and her brain said, well, the only way to get out of this is if we make money. And there's another person who went through that and then had a negative coping mechanism, right? So her coping mechanism could have been, let's make money, let's get out of this, and let's work hard, right? A workaholic. And that it kind of ended up benefiting her. And there are some people whose coping mechanisms are drugs or different things like that because of the environment that they're in or the access to information. Maybe she had a mentor that helped her versus this person who had a friend who was like, hey, just smoke this and it's going to make you feel better. And they in that moment, that's what they thought was best. So we have to account for it's a case-by-case basis and not just assume that like we should all just have this epiphany and be millionaires.
And I don't care if people call me lame, square, they're going to question my blackness. I mean, I don't care. I'm getting out.
Well, speaking about blackness, do you think there's a correlation between people from the African diaspora and people of color and poverty? You don't think there's like a relationship there?
It's true that, you know, I belong to a community that makes less than certain other communities. That's true. Significantly less. But you can't look at differences between groups and say it's only because of systems. Systems played a huge deal to it. I'm not discounting that at all.
If it's not only because of systems, then why is the black community impoverished? Are they all meeting together and deciding this? What does that mean?
It's a real big deal, and we're working to change that. But also, I mean, statistically, like, people from my old neighborhood and people, you know, around this in these communities, they spend about 50% more on shoes than people who are not in those neighborhoods.
But there's a question of why, and I think the other assumption is if they didn't, you're saying 50% more on shoes. So the average person, let's just say, spends $200 on shoes a year, $300 on shoes a year. So they're spending $400, and that's the reason why they're not rich and successful?
And it's like, man, that...
Well, not only that, Todd, but I think I looked up a recent statistic that said that Asian households, their children tend to study 13 to 15 hours a week, where in a black household, it's like 3 hours a week.
This is a huge issue that I have, and I wanted to address this. They keep bringing up reasons as to why there are discrepancies, but they're not asking the question of why that led to that discrepancy. For example, they're saying, oh, well, the African American community studies far less than the Asian American community. So that's why the African American community is poor. Okay, let's just say that's true. But if the reason for why they study less is not in their control, for example, the African American community is a community that was brought here hundreds of years ago through slavery and oppression, were oppressed literally up until recently, systematically, significantly. They are still oppressed in many different ways. But let's just say when it comes to things like housing, there was a significant discrepancy and sorts of oppression that was happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. There are some practices today that are being discovered, but let's just say globally or nationally it was happening back in the 80s and 90s significantly. And so when we compare that to Asian Americans who came far more recently, we're developed culture basically from where they came from versus African Americans who developed culture much more strongly in America because that's where they've been and they've been longer. So if you look at the average African American, they came a lot earlier. They struggled under oppression a lot longer in America versus the Asian American community, or even let's say the Middle Eastern community, where we came a lot later on. So the culture that we have is adopted from the actual places that we're from, like the Middle East or Asia. And so they're bringing over that culture, which had a far different experience than African Americans in America today. And so if we look at, let's just say in the 60s, that was the Civil Rights Act, right? We don't even have to look into slavery where people are like, well, that was hundreds of years ago. Okay, great. But just because slavery ended doesn't mean at that point everyone was handy dandy holding hands and it's like, oh, you're African American, slavery is over. You want a good job? No. Up until like the 90s, they struggled to get jobs significantly. And there's still evidence today that they're struggling to get jobs at certain rates. I mean, if we look at the average CEO of the top 500 companies, I think 1 or 2 of them are African American. So we need to understand that the reason why African Americans may be studying less is because the lifestyle that they're living. I'm going to give a quick example of this. If I'm African American and my parents and my grandparents, were here in America obviously for hundreds of years, and they want to go buy a property back in the 60s, let's just say the 70s, maybe even the 80s, and even until the 90s with redlining, that they were actually forced and pushed into African American communities. Now imagine you're forced into a community where it's just all African Americans. When you want to go sell that property, 70 or 80% of Americans who were white at the time are not interested in buying that property because it's an all African American property neighborhood. So there's no interest for them to buy it, right? They feel out of place. And so now that African American couple or family can't even sell their house because far fewer people are interested in buying it. At that time, the housing is declining, which means that the property tax, which is used to fund the local schools, are now declining, which means that the students, people like me, would then suffer, my education would suffer, because I happened to be born into a place where my family was forced into, the only choice that they had. We had zoning laws that were forcing African Americans in certain communities. There were actually millionaires on record who would go buy out properties of entire neighborhoods and only sell to African Americans at lower prices to get them in there, dropping the prices of the houses in those areas and forcing them to basically have far less money, because most of the equity, most of the money and wealth that Americans have today are in their assets like housing. And so the African American housing has dropped significantly while the white areas and the white neighborhoods have gone up significantly since the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so you have to understand that I am now, let's just say if I'm African American, I am now receiving subpar education in an area where a lot more people are poor. And when people are more poor, they're more likely to commit crimes. So now I'm in an area where there's a lot more crimes. And maybe my family's not making as much because in the area there's not as many jobs and my family can't afford to drive far outside the city to get a better job. And so I'm receiving subpar education. My grandparents and parents couldn't even go to college because it was segregated back then. And so I don't have parents that were educated as well as, let's just say, white Americans. And now I'm struggling because I don't have parents who have that education system. We're in an area where crime is high. My parents may not be making as much because of the jobs that are in the area, which means that I'm now focusing less and less on school because I'm more worried about where my next meal is going to come from, the crime that's happening in my area, the lack of education that's happening. So at my school, it's not going to be as interesting because I don't have an iPad to learn like maybe other people, or good textbooks, and the roof is leaking in our schools because we're not getting as much funding to fix those issues. So there's a vast discrepancy between races in America that they have gone through back in the day that is still having an echoing effect till today. So saying that, oh, well, they're studying more is a complete disingenuous argument to understand why they might be studying more, is because they came more recently. Although they may not have been treated completely amazingly by Americans, and they did suffer, or by white Americans, and they did suffer, let's say the Middle Eastern community or the Asian community. There's a far different experience in America being African American than it is being Asian American or Middle Eastern. And we need to understand that. And we need to understand that they're more likely to have come from, let's just say, Asia or the Middle East far more recently than African Americans. So their culture, again, is coming from a completely different experience. So let's move on.
I know you said it's not like a race issue, but when you think about the way that we got here as like
Exactly.
African people, it was a race issue.
Exactly.
We didn't have a chance to discover America like the other people did. So I feel like how you had mentioned that Asian Americans, they study more than black households. You don't feel like those communities are kind of socialized in their upbringing to be more inclined to care about their finances?
They have the privilege of being able to focus on school.
Look rich than actually be rich. I think that's a part of like our community.
It's a culture, it's a choice.
Well,
culture is not really a choice if I'm grown 18 years in a culture, right? I didn't choose to be born in that culture. I didn't choose to be brainwashed by that culture, let's just say. So we have to understand that. The second thing to understand is how culture even comes to be. And this is where it bothers me. You know, I studied, like I said, master's in psychology, master's in international relations, bachelor's in philosophy, politics. I studied religion to understand that culture isn't just something that people choose, right? They develop culture by the environment. So let's say, for example, the African American community was oppressed for so long. So let's just say if we look at things like the barber shops or the churches and community centers, right? And a lot of people, kind of associate that with, let's just say, African Americans. They didn't just choose to go to the barber shop and kick it there. That's not what happened. If you actually study the making of African Americans, there's an amazing book literally called The Making of African Americans. The reason is after slavery ended, they would meet there to actually plan how they would travel north. And it was out of necessity that they met there, and that's where they developed their culture. So it wasn't a choice that they decided that we should all meet at the church for fun and have cake. No, they literally had no choice but to meet with each other because they were trying to escape the oppression that was happening in the South. And so they developed that culture under oppression. So certain things in culture are developed out of necessity of environment. So again, if there's something happening in our environment that is causing us to do something, then it's not a choice that we're making to have that type of culture.
It's a
not a
it's
choice.
I don't
To a certain extent.
I think it's a choice.
2021. I
do think it's a choice. I'm not going to say it's not a choice, but I'm saying, do
It's
you
not a
feel like
choice.
some people don't have the same choices as other people's in different
I
communities?
think some people don't have the mental capacity to allocate the energy to learn the rules of the game, quote unquote, because their instincts are kicking in to just survive.
I think
It's
trauma
true.
plays a heavier role than we
Exactly.
like to account for. Trauma is the reason why I'm here. I come from a family, a heavily cult Islamic family, and the things that I was doing in my life they didn't agree with. They pretty much sent people to my house to kill me. I was set up multiple times. They hacked my social media pages, both my iPhones, you know what I mean? So I don't want to just kind of ignore trauma as if it doesn't really matter in terms of what you are capable of doing, because people that are traumatized and people that do deal with a lot of oppression tend to get some of their choices removed.
Exactly. When we look at people's coping mechanisms, it's not a choice. They're not just choosing that coping mechanism. That's their brain adapting. Again, if two people go to war, one person gets PTSD and the other one doesn't. That person who gets PTSD is not choosing to get PTSD. That is how their brain reacts to certain environments, while other people's don't react that way.
I can acknowledge that, yes.
So we can't look at them and say, well, you chose to have it, and thus, if your PTSD is affecting your ability to work and make money, that's your choice. Not true.
My name is Hanifa. I'm an author, and I'm currently homeless, so I don't make any money right now.
That's also interesting because earlier on, she stepped up saying that being poor is a choice. Said, oh, well, when I came here, I was homeless, making it seem like she got out of it, but she's still homeless, which I don't know why she stepped up saying that she, being poor is a choice when she's still poor, unless she's saying that she's actively choosing to be poor.
Now, I grew up Muslim my entire life, and in Islam, it is permissible to marry your cousin. So my family enforced sexual acts in between cousins. It led to me having to flee my hometown and come all the way to California, which is 2,600 miles away, just so that I could avoid being killed.
That's another thing. There are a lot of people that suffer in many different countries like that, and even in America today, in certain cults or environments or housing where they're being abused, they're being hurt, they're not able to make the choices that they may want to make, or they're being brainwashed into thinking that the choices they want to make is wrong. So I have clients that I worked with who literally were taught that schooling is bad, they're going to get brainwashed and it's all evil and it's the devil, and they didn't know they were a kid. They didn't choose to believe that. They literally, everyone believes their parents at a certain age, and for years and years they were brainwashed into thinking that. So now they're struggling with a lot of mental illness because of the abuse they went through, and now they're struggling to get a job because they never got an education. They're struggling to go to school because they don't have the resources to do it. There's so many issues and nuances that go on with this. We can't just constantly think that like, oh, everyone just needs to like stop being poor and work hard.
$15 an hour is not enough for minimum wage.
I did have a question for you two. You both mentioned that you suffer from addiction and that as soon as you get a paycheck, it's gone, whether it's gambling or weed or shopping or whatever. If you had a higher income, would that change?
Personally, yes, because the whole reason I gamble is like, let me get that $60,000 win and I'll stop gambling. That's my mindset, right?
I mean, I'll agree and disagree. I think, and nothing to say about them, but if they're saying that like, oh, if they won 60,000, they would quit gambling. Most people who are gambling addicts, and I know this because my grandpa he lost $60 million gambling basically. And my mom, has definitely a gambling addiction. I definitely struggle with that. And I laugh about it only because we were very fortunate to have our addiction pay off versus many people who didn't. But most people, even if they won 60 grand, would continue to gamble. I hope that they understand that over here. I hope that they understand that if they do win that 60 grand, there's a good chance that they're going to think it's not enough. They're going to want to gamble more. I definitely have had $1,000 turned into $25,000 just recently gambling and thinking that it wasn't enough. I wanted to keep playing, and I eventually pretty much lost all of it. So definitely something to keep in mind is that mental illness is a huge struggle for a lot of people when it comes to stuff like this. But maybe if they made more money, they can afford better mental health care, which would then in turn help them be able to save more money and be able to get better resources.
And another thing is, I feel like if I were to have like passive income, I guess you can say, or be financially stable, I can pursue and distract myself with my actual passions. Like, I want to start a true crime YouTube channel, but I don't have the laptop, I don't have the camera. The addiction takes control, so I don't think about the things I don't have, and I just feel numb and thoughtless, and I'm just enjoying my TV. And so yeah, I feel like it would change. I would be able to have other distractions that are beneficial to me in a positive way.
If you had more money, you could probably have access to help. Like,
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Psychiatrists, because that's really expensive.
And the economy is rigged because if you have more money or born to a family that has more money, you can have better mental health care, which means you could probably be more focused on work and bettering yourself. So again, it is rigged.
You can't afford it living off of minimum wage,
I feel like a lot of jobs will pay minimum wage, but they will expect maximum effort. And I'm like, if you're gonna pay me minimum wage, I'm putting in the bare minimum effort.
I've always looked at it the opposite way. Like if I go into a company and they're paying me minimum wage, I do everything that I can to get promoted.
So I will say I completely agree with him here. There's a bit of a mixed bag. Yes, companies should pay more, but at the same time, you can advocate for that, but also try and want to build up that company. Because although you may be suffering, you shouldn't look at that as a reason to just say, well, since I'm suffering, I'm going to wallow in this suffering. I'm not going to try and make the best of it. I'm not saying that if you didn't make the best of it, that it's your fault, because again, the evidence shows that it isn't your fault. But there are a lot of people who do have the mental capacity, the environment, the resources to better themselves, and who might be more about, focusing on just being like, hey, this isn't fair. I get it. It's not fair. But you might as well try your hardest to get out of it and live a better life, because the odds are that things aren't going to drastically change in your lifetime. If you study anything about psychology, sociology, any of these things, politics, you know that it takes decades and decades for things to change like this. So if you're kind of just waiting around hoping things are going to change, they're not going to. So if you're one of the few people that happen to have the happenstance theory, which means you have the opportunity to better your life or work hard at, let's say, a minimum wage job because there's more opportunity above it, please do it. Don't look at it like, well, I'm gonna work the minimum wage and I'm gonna give the minimum. If your company does have the ability to grow, do it. Try your hardest. Just because it may not be in your choice doesn't mean you shouldn't try your hardest, because although it may not be in your choice, if you do work as hard as you can, as much as your body can handle, your brain can handle, it potentially could be enough to make it out of poverty. And at that point, you might as well live out of poverty than in poverty, even though the system may be rigged.
For me, my mindset is working minimum wage is always temporary. It's always been like, okay, we work minimum wage, but we're gonna work harder to get promoted, and then we're gonna do something else with our lives.
I think this is a weird mindset to have. One, there aren't enough jobs to pay everyone a good wage. A lot of people kind of think that minimum wage is temporary and only young people should do it, or maybe if you're just transitioning. The studies show that although a small portion of society works at minimum wage, a large portion, I think it's around like 50%, work very close to minimum wage. So it's a game of musical chairs where you can't say, well, you should use this to go up. If everyone listened to your advice, it would physically be impossible to have everyone being paid well currently, because not every company is paying. Majority of companies are not paying well enough. A majority of companies are paying close to minimum wage. So we cannot say it's temporary because you had the fortunate ability to, let's say, live at home and start a business, or let's say, have the ability to, because I think Jenny in a previous episode me and her did, which is Poor vs. Rich, she talked about being 17, picking up a plane ticket and traveling the world.
Anytime I have free time, like I'll pick up a plane ticket, go somewhere. As soon as I turned 17, it was just like one travel after another. It's just like, that's like so literally my number one passion.
I would very strongly venture to guess that her parents helped her in many different ways to do that, because I don't think a 17-year-old could physically possibly pay to travel the world, even if they were staying in hostels. So if they have that ability, they have the ability to learn. She even talked about how she got a master's degree at France and I think at like USC or something. So they had the ability, and I would probably venture to guess that she did not pay for her education. I would bet that, because we spoke on that episode, she never mentioned that, and there's a good chance that she had her education paid for. So being able to have that opportunity that she had, of course it could be temporary for her, but for most people it's not temporary. It's all that they can get with the resources that they have, mixed with the troubles and barriers that they're going through.
Many, many, many years ago, you could go live off the land. You didn't have to work for somebody in order to survive. All the land is taken. It's in federal land. You can't go fishing in these federal streams. You can't do that. So that's not possible at scale. In order to survive, you must work for someone else. That forces wages down, right? People can't just go, F you, I'm not gonna work, I'm gonna chill and work on my novel or do whatever. So that's the part where I agree with you. I'm a supporter of UBI. So
I love
people
that.
aren't forced to work.
That's a great point. I think there's a number of beneficial things with UBI. One, you have a lot of people who can transition jobs because they have a safety net. You have a lot of people who may not be the smartest with their money, but it's not going to be like they blow it all at once, but they're monthly getting money, and so they're able to adapt over time and get better at handling their money because it's consistently coming in. Just like the people who, let's say, won the lottery and they take the lump sum, a lot of them lose all that money, but if they had taken the 25-year payment, almost all of them obviously would be successful still, because they would still be getting those payments. And so having a continuous payment per month is very helpful for society. More businesses would pop up. It would just be beneficial across the board.
And where I disagree is that we don't pay people based on what they need. And you were kind of pointing to this. I give the minimum effort if you pay me minimum wage. But there's certain jobs that are not worth $15 an hour, just frankly not worth it. Maybe they're worth 5, maybe they're worth 2. I want you to watch TV for an hour in your house and tell me how many commercials come up, because I'm doing a survey. I want to pay you $7 an hour. You think I should have to pay you $15 an hour for that? Or would you take $7 an hour to sit on your couch and count commercials that show up on the television?
I mean, yeah, I would take any money.
Okay, so everybody here agreed that it should be $15 an hour minimum wage.
Yeah.
But by making the wage $15 an hour, you just eliminated a job that he's willing to do.
So I think this also doesn't really make sense. For example, $15 an hour relates to you working a full hour, you getting paid $15 an hour. If that person cannot leave their couch and has to, maybe they can go to the bathroom, but they can't leave their couch, they have to watch the TV, right? They can't just be sitting on their phone because they have to count the commercials because that's their job. You're taking up an hour of their time, and so they should get paid relative to how much time it's going to take them to be able to do that job. So if it's going to take me an hour to do that job, I should get $15 an hour, because if I work let's say 40 hours a week on that job and you're paying me $7 an hour, I literally couldn't survive. Now, if you're telling me that, hey, you could potentially work another job because you're just sitting on the couch watching the commercials, okay, great. Then you're not really paying me $15 an hour or $7 an hour, because if you divide up the time I'm actually working, which is, the occasional commercial, click the button, commercial, click the button, and I can basically be doing my other stuff, then yeah, you could basically argue that you're really only paying me, let's just say, $7 per hour, but in reality, I'm only working like 15 minutes of that hour, which then you would calculate and say, no, I am getting paid $15 an hour. So if you tell me that, no, you can't work another job because you have to be focused on that TV, then no, I should get paid $15 an hour. You are taking up my time, and I shouldn't work 40 hours a week for basically, $1,200 a month because you just want to pay me that? I don't care if the job isn't worth it. Then that job shouldn't exist. You cannot argue that, hey, I have a really good business idea, but it will only work if I pay my workers 50 cents an hour, so I should be able to do that. No. The whole point of society, the whole point of government is to make sure that we all live a decent life. It is literally in the Constitution that the government's job is to promote the general welfare of the people, not specific people, but the general welfare of the people.
More money, more problems.
So we're going to end it right after this, but really interesting to hear what she says here, because she contradicts
More
herself.
Problems, but that's a path that I'm willing to take on, because the problems that come along with not having money, I can't imagine going back there.
She just contradicted herself. She just said more money equals more problems. That's why she stepped up. But then she proceeded to say that she doesn't want to go back to not having as much money because those problems were a lot. So she's obviously saying that she has less problems now, and she can't go back to that because that was horrible. So she's literally contradicting herself.
I made it a point to position myself adjacent to people who I felt like I could learn from. I remember parking my little Chevy Cruze up off of Griffith Observatory in Hollywood Hills just to be around money.
Yeah, she completely contradicted herself. So that's pretty much the end of the episode. The rest of it is them just talking about, more money, more problems, and a lot of them just kind of agree that you kind of get different problems. We know statistically and psychologically that at $80,000 a year, roughly, that's when people kind of top out when it comes to problems. At $80,000 to $90,000 a year, at that point, you're covering all your basic needs. Let's just say there's 100 things to stress about in a day. Money can solve 20 of them. And although you have 80 problems and you could still be depressed and all that, 20 problems are now solved. That is still a significant help. Most people who have a lot of money have a lot more ability to better themselves because they have the ability to get better help. They have less things to worry about, which means they have more time to focus on themselves. And so that's something to take into account when it comes to more money, more problems. Thank you so much for watching. This episode was really interesting. It was really hard to watch some of them say some certain things, but overall, I don't think anyone was too extreme. So I really did appreciate everyone who went on this episode and talked. I really wish I could have been on it, but hopefully I'll be on another one soon. So thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. This is my new channel, and I would appreciate all the support I can get. Thank you guys so much for watching.